The antique mirror arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in moth-eaten velvet and accompanied by a letter written in spidery handwriting that made Sarah's skin crawl before she even read the words. "To my dear niece," it began, "this belonged to your grandmother, and her grandmother before that. It has been in our family for generations, though I confess I never had the courage to hang it properly. Perhaps you will succeed where I have failed. With love and trepidation, Aunt Millicent." Sarah had barely known her great-aunt, remembering only a peculiar woman who smelled of lavender and spoke in whispers at family gatherings, always glancing over her shoulder as if something invisible followed her. Now standing in her new apartment's living room, Sarah unwrapped the mirror with careful hands, revealing an ornate bronze frame that seemed to shift colors in the afternoon light, its surface etched with symbols she didn't recognize but that made her fingers tingle when she traced them. The mirror itself was remarkable, its glass so clear and deep that Sarah felt she could step through it into another world. Her reflection looked back at her, but something seemed off, though she couldn't quite place what. Maybe it was the way her eyes appeared darker, or how her smile seemed to linger a moment too long after she'd stopped smiling. She hung it in her bedroom, across from her bed where it caught the morning light beautifully and made the small room appear twice its size. That first night she woke to find herself staring at her reflection in the moonlight, though she had no memory of turning toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back perfectly still, but Sarah could have sworn she saw it blink first. The next morning brought a phone call from her mother asking about the move and whether Sarah had settled in properly. "Oh, and did you get Aunt Millicent's package? She was quite insistent that it reach you before." Her mother's voice trailed off. "Before what?" Sarah asked. But her mother had already changed the subject, asking about Sarah's new job at the local newspaper. Sarah worked as a journalist, specializing in historical pieces, which was partly why she'd moved to this old New England town where every building seemed to have a story and every resident claimed their house was haunted. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd just inherited what was quite possibly a haunted mirror. Over the following days, Sarah began to notice small changes in her reflection. At first, she attributed them to fatigue or stress from the move. Her reflection seemed to move a fraction of a second before she did, or sometimes appeared to continue moving after she'd stopped. When she brushed her teeth, her reflection would keep brushing for just a moment longer. When she turned away from the mirror, she caught glimpses of her reflection still facing forward, watching her. She mentioned it to her coworker Mark, who laughed and suggested she was spending too much time alone in her new place. "Mirrors can play tricks on you," he said, "especially old ones. The glass gets warped over time." But Sarah knew this was different. She'd worked with enough antiques in her research to recognize warped glass, and this wasn't that. The dream started on the 5th night. In them, she would wake in her bedroom to find someone else lying in her bed, someone who looked exactly like her, but whose eyes held a depth of malice that made Sarah's blood run cold. The other Sarah would sit up slowly, never breaking eye contact, and begin to speak in Sarah's own voice but with words Sarah would never say. "You don't belong here," the dream Sarah would whisper. "This is my place now. You're just the copy." Sarah would try to scream, try to move, but found herself paralyzed until she woke gasping in the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she was sure her neighbors could hear it through the thin walls. By day, the mirror seemed innocent enough, reflecting the room accurately and showing Sarah her normal appearance, but she began to avoid looking at it directly, instead watching it peripherally as she moved about her bedroom. That's when she noticed that her reflection sometimes continued its activities even when Sarah had stopped. She would be combing her hair and stop to examine a split end, but her reflection would keep combing, its movements mechanical and endless. When Sarah would quickly turn to look directly at the mirror, her reflection would be perfectly normal, matching her every movement with precision. The research began almost obsessively. Sarah spent her lunch breaks at the local historical society, poring over records and genealogies, trying to trace the mirror's history. What she found disturbed her more than she'd expected. The mirror appeared in family records dating back to the 1800s, always passed down through the female line, and always accompanied by tragedy. Sarah's great-great-grandmother had owned it, and had been found dead in her bedroom, apparently having cut her own throat while staring into the mirror. Her great-grandmother had suffered a complete mental breakdown after 3 months of ownership, spending the rest of her life in an asylum, claiming that her reflection was trying to steal her life. Sarah's grandmother had given it away after only 2 weeks, refusing to speak of it again, and had died young of a sudden heart attack. Aunt Millicent had kept it wrapped and stored in her attic for 40 years, and had recently passed away in her sleep, just days after deciding to send it to Sarah. The pattern was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Each woman had reported the same phenomena: reflections that moved independently, dreams of being replaced, and a growing sense that something malevolent was watching them from within the glass. The Historical Society's records also contained newspaper clippings about other families who had owned similar mirrors, all reporting identical experiences and similarly tragic endings. Sarah photocopied everything she could find and returned home that evening with a growing sense of dread. That night she covered the mirror with a sheet before going to bed, but it made no difference. In her dreams, the sheet was always transparent, and her reflection could still watch her, still move independently, still speak in her voice with words of malice and possession. "You can't hide from yourself," it said, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the reflection's voice was becoming stronger, more confident, while her own voice in the dream grew weaker and more distant. She woke to find the sheet on the floor, though she had no memory of removing it. Her reflection stood at the mirror's surface, fully dressed, while Sarah lay in bed in her nightgown. As Sarah sat up, her reflection remained standing, and for a terrible moment, they stared at each other in perfect opposition. Then her reflection smiled, a cold expression that Sarah had never worn, and mouthed the words, "Soon now." Sarah leaped from bed and threw the sheet back over the mirror, but she could feel eyes watching her from beneath the fabric. The next day at work, Mark commented that Sarah looked terrible. "You've got dark circles under your eyes and you're pale as a ghost. Are you eating? Sleeping?" Sarah wanted to tell him about the mirror, about the dreams and the research and the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong, but she knew how it would sound. Instead, she asked if he knew anything about local legends or folklore concerning mirrors. Mark, who had lived in the town his entire life, thought for a moment. "There are stories," he said slowly. "Old families talk about cursed mirrors, ones that trap souls or steal lives. Most people dismiss it as superstition, but my grandmother always said that mirrors were doorways and you had to be careful what you let through." That evening, Sarah decided to conduct an experiment. She set up her laptop to record the mirror overnight, positioning it so that both she and her reflection would be visible. If her reflection was truly moving independently, she would have proof. She went to bed with the sheet covering the mirror, but positioned so that the camera could still capture both her and the covered glass. She lay awake for hours, listening to the old building's creaks and groans, before finally falling into an uneasy sleep. She woke before dawn and immediately checked the recording. What she saw made her stomach lurch with terror and disbelief. In the footage around 3 a.m., the sheet had begun to move as if something beneath it was pressing against the fabric. Then impossibly, a hand had emerged from the mirror's surface, pushing the sheet aside. Sarah watched in horror as her own reflection climbed out of the mirror and stood in her bedroom, looking down at Sarah's sleeping form with an expression of calculating malice. The reflection moved around the room, touching Sarah's belongings, examining her life, before returning to the mirror and stepping back through the glass as if it were water. The sheet fell back into place and everything appeared normal. Sarah backed away from the laptop, her hands shaking. This was no longer about psychological pressure or family curses or old superstitions. Something that looked exactly like her was living inside the mirror, and it was getting stronger. She remembered the historical records, the pattern of increasing activity followed by tragedy, and realized she was running out of time. The reflection was learning, growing more confident, preparing for something. She called in sick to work and spent the day researching methods for dealing with cursed objects. Most of what she found was either religious in nature or required items and knowledge she didn't possess. Breaking the mirror seemed obvious, but every account she read warned against it, claiming that destroying the mirror while something was trapped inside would release it into the world permanently. She needed to find another way. That afternoon, she drove to Aunt Millicent's house, which was still being prepared for sale by the estate. The realtor, recognizing Sarah as family, allowed her to look through Millicent's belongings for anything else that might have been intended for her. In the attic, Sarah found a wooden box containing letters, diary entries, and newspaper clippings that painted a much clearer picture of the mirror's history. Millicent had spent decades researching it, documenting every family member who had owned it and their eventual fate. The most recent entry, dated just a week before Millicent's death, was written in an increasingly shaky hand. "It knows I'm dying. It's getting impatient. I've kept it wrapped and hidden for 40 years, but it's still growing stronger. Sarah is young and strong. It will want her most of all. I pray she's smart enough to find this box, smart enough to understand what I couldn't bring myself to tell her. The mirror doesn't just show reflections, it steals them. Each woman who owned it lost herself piece by piece, until the thing in the mirror took her place entirely. I've managed to resist, but barely, and only by never looking at it directly. But I'm old now, and it knows. I must send it away before I die, or it will be free to hunt on its own." The final entry was barely legible. The binding is weakening. The reflection grows bolder. If Sarah cannot find a way to strengthen the prison, she must destroy it and accept the consequences. Better to release one demon than to let it create many. Sarah returned home as the sun was setting. Millicent's research clutched in her trembling hands. The apartment felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. The sheet over the mirror hung perfectly still, but Sarah could feel something watching her from behind it. She forced herself to eat dinner, to go through the motions of a normal evening, while planning what she had to do. According to Millicent's research, the mirror was bound by symbols carved into its frame, symbols that had to be maintained and renewed periodically. Sarah examined the frame closely and found that many of the symbols were indeed worn and faded, some barely visible. Millicent had included detailed drawings of what the symbols should look like and instructions for renewal, but the process required Sarah to look directly into the mirror while carving, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist whatever was waiting for her there. As night fell, Sarah prepared for what she knew might be her final confrontation with the thing in the mirror. She gathered the tools she would need: a sharp carving knife, silver paint, and a small hammer in case she decided destruction was the only option. She also wrote a letter explaining everything, to be found if she didn't survive the night. She addressed it to Mark, hoping he would understand and make sure the mirror was properly handled. At midnight, Sarah removed the sheet and faced her reflection. It was waiting for her, dressed in clothes Sarah didn't own, with an expression of triumph that chilled her to the bone. "Finally," it said, its voice perfectly matching Sarah's, but carrying an undertone of something ancient and hungry. "I was beginning to think you'd never be brave enough to face me." Sarah began carving the first symbol, her hand shaking as she tried to follow Millicent's careful diagrams. Her reflection watched with interest, occasionally offering mocking commentary. "Do you really think that will work? Those symbols are old, older than you understand, and they're weakening whether you refresh them or not. I've had decades to study them, to find their flaws." As Sarah worked, her reflection began to move independently again, but more boldly than before. It would walk to different parts of the mirror's view, examining Sarah from different angles, sometimes disappearing entirely for minutes at a time. When it returned, it would be carrying objects that Sarah didn't recognize, tools and artifacts that seemed to exist only in the mirror's world. "You're just postponing the inevitable," the reflection said as Sarah finished the third symbol. "Every woman before you tried the same thing. Some lasted longer than others, but in the end, I always win. I always take their place." "Why?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her carving. "What do you get from this?" "Life," the reflection replied simply. "Real life in the real world. Do you know what it's like to exist only as a reflection? To watch life happen but never participate? I've been trapped in mirrors for over 2 centuries, passed from owner to owner, growing stronger with each woman I've consumed. But I don't just want to watch anymore, I want to live." Sarah finished the 5th symbol and looked up to find her reflection standing much closer to the mirror's surface, its face pressed against the glass, as if it were trying to push through. "You're too late," it whispered. "The binding was already broken. Those symbols you're carving, they're not repair marks, they're release keys." Horror flooded through Sarah as she looked at the symbols she'd been carving, comparing them to Millicent's diagrams. In her fear and haste, she'd been reading the pages wrong, following the wrong set of instructions. She hadn't been strengthening the prison, she'd been opening it. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and Sarah's reflection smiled with genuine warmth for the first time, though the expression looked wrong on a face Sarah knew was her own. "Thank you," it said, reaching through the glass. "I'll take good care of your life." Sarah grabbed the hammer and swung it at the mirror, but her reflection caught her wrist through the glass, its grip impossibly strong. "I told you," it said. "Breaking the mirror won't help now. The binding is broken. I'm already free." The thing that looked like Sarah stepped through the mirror as easily as walking through a doorway. For a moment, 2 identical women stood in the bedroom, facing each other. Then Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, as if part of her soul was being pulled away. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were becoming translucent. "The transition is always difficult," her doppelganger said with false sympathy. "But don't worry, you'll still exist after a fashion. Every woman I've replaced is still in there, in the mirror watching. You'll have plenty of company." Sarah tried to scream, tried to fight, but found herself becoming less substantial with each passing second. Her reflection, now solid and real, began examining Sarah's belongings, learning the details of the life it was about to assume. It picked up Sarah's phone and began scrolling through her contacts, her messages, studying the relationships it would need to maintain. "Sarah Martinez," it said, testing the name. 28 years old, journalist, recently moved to town. No close family nearby, few friends, perfect for a quiet transition. No one will notice the small changes in personality, the subtle differences in behavior. They never do. As the last of Sarah's physical form faded away, she found herself trapped behind the mirror's surface just as the thing had described. She could see her bedroom, could see the creature that had stolen her life, but she couldn't affect the physical world in any way. Around her in the mirror's space, she sensed other presences, the souls of all the women who had owned the mirror before her. They welcomed her with silent sympathy, understanding her loss because they had all experienced the same theft. The creature wearing Sarah's face looked into the mirror one last time before leaving the apartment. "Don't look so sad," it said. "I'll live a good life in your place. I've had plenty of practice." Over the following days, Sarah could only watch helplessly as the thing that had replaced her took over her existence. It showed up to work at the newspaper, charming Mark and her other colleagues with slightly different mannerisms that no one seemed to notice. It was more confident than Sarah had ever been, more socially adept, and it used Sarah's research skills to write articles that were more compelling than anything Sarah had ever produced. In a terrible irony, the creature was better at being Sarah than Sarah herself had been. Mark, who had worried about Sarah's appearance and behavior, commented several times on how much better she seemed, how much more vibrant and alive. The creature accepted these compliments with a smile that looked exactly like Sarah's but felt completely different to the trapped souls watching from within the mirror. The creature also began its next hunt almost immediately. It started visiting antique shops and estate sales, looking for other cursed objects, other opportunities to expand its influence. Sarah realized with growing horror that the mirror had never been the creature's only prison, just its most recent one. There were other mirrors, other trapped souls, other families that had suffered the same losses throughout history. One evening, as the creature sat in Sarah's apartment researching local genealogies, it spoke to the mirror as if Sarah and the others could hear it. "You're wondering about my plans," it said, without looking up from Sarah's laptop. "It's simple, really. I've spent centuries moving from woman to woman, life to life, always having to start over, always having to learn new identities. But now I'm thinking bigger. Why settle for one life when I could have many?" The creature had been using Sarah's journalistic credentials to research other families with histories of mysterious deaths, other women who had inherited cursed objects. It was building a network, preparing to expand its operations. Sarah understood now that she hadn't just been a victim. She had been recruited as an unwilling accomplice. The creature was using her knowledge, her skills, her reputation to identify and target other potential victims. 2 weeks after the possession, the creature brought home a guest, a young woman named Emily, who had recently inherited a music box from her deceased grandmother. Sarah recognized the signs immediately in the girl's pale complexion and dark circled eyes, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if something were following her. The creature, wearing Sarah's face and speaking in Sarah's voice, interviewed Emily about her experiences, ostensibly for a newspaper article about local folklore. "It plays music on its own," Emily confided, wrapping her arms around herself. "Always the same tune, always at 3 in the morning. And when I listen to it, I have dreams about a little girl who looks like me but isn't me. She wants to come out and play," she says. The creature nodded sympathetically, taking notes in Sarah's handwriting. "That must be terrifying. Have you considered getting rid of it?" "I can't," Emily said quickly. "I've tried, but every time I take it somewhere, it's back in my room by morning. And lately when I wake up, I find myself dancing to the music, but I don't remember getting out of bed." Sarah watched in helpless rage as the creature offered to help Emily research her family history, to find out more about the music box's origins. It was the same offer Sarah might have made, the same journalistic curiosity that had led Sarah to research her own cursed mirror. But Sarah could see the predatory calculation behind the creature's helpful facade. Over the following weeks, the creature maintained contact with Emily, while continuing its research into other cursed objects and their owners. It had identified at least a dozen potential victims in the surrounding area, women who had inherited mysterious heirlooms and were beginning to experience supernatural phenomena. The creature was building a collection, preparing to expand beyond the single mirror that had been its prison for so long. Sarah began to understand the full scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just about her own tragedy. It was about the creature's evolution from a single predator to something much more dangerous. It was learning to manipulate the connections between cursed objects, to coordinate multiple hauntings, to expand its influence beyond anything it had attempted before. The other souls trapped in the mirror space tried to communicate with Sarah, to warn her about what was coming. Through fragmentary impressions and shared memories, Sarah learned that the creature had been growing stronger with each woman it consumed, not just gaining their life force but absorbing their knowledge, their skills, their connections to the living world. Sarah's journalistic abilities and research skills had given it capabilities it had never possessed before. 1 month after the possession, Emily disappeared. The local police found her apartment empty, with no signs of struggle, as if she had simply vanished. But Sarah knew what had really happened. The creature had found a way to transfer Emily's soul into the music box while taking control of her body, just as it had done with Sarah in the mirror. Now there were two creatures wearing stolen faces, two predators working in coordination. The pattern accelerated. More women with inherited cursed objects began disappearing, always without a trace, always with their apartments left perfectly neat, as if they had planned to leave. The creature wearing Sarah's face continued working at the newspaper, even writing articles about the mysterious disappearances, playing the role of a concerned journalist investigating a troubling trend. Mark began to notice that Sarah seemed different, more detached, more clinical in her approach to the human tragedies she was covering. "You used to be more empathetic," he said one day, as they reviewed her latest article. "These women who are missing, they're real people with families and friends. Your writing makes them sound like statistics." The creature smiled with Sarah's face, but with eyes that held no warmth. "I'm just trying to maintain professional objectivity," it said. "Getting too emotionally involved compromises the integrity of the reporting." Mark looked troubled but didn't press the issue, and Sarah watched from her mirror prison as another opportunity for discovery slipped away. She tried desperately to find some way to communicate, to warn someone, but the mirror's glass remained an impermeable barrier between her and the world she had lost. The creature's network continued to grow. It had learned to identify and cultivate relationships with women who owned cursed objects, offering help and support while gradually guiding them toward the choices that would make them vulnerable to possession. It used Sarah's credentials and Emily's social connections and the skills and knowledge of every woman it had consumed to become more effective at hunting. 6 months after Sarah's possession, the creature had replaced 12 women and controlled a network of cursed objects throughout New England. It had also begun targeting men who owned cursed items, learning to adapt its techniques to male victims. The scope of its operation had grown beyond anything Sarah could have imagined, and she realized that her own tragedy had been just the beginning of something much larger and more terrible. The creature still visited the mirror occasionally, speaking to Sarah and the other trapped souls as if they were old friends. "You should be proud," it said during one of these visits. "Your skills, your knowledge, they've helped me accomplish more in 6 months than I managed in the previous 2 centuries. Sarah, especially, you've been invaluable. Your research abilities, your understanding of genealogy and historical records, they've allowed me to identify bloodlines and trace cursed objects with unprecedented efficiency." Sarah could only watch as the creature continued its work, using her face, her voice, her reputation to facilitate its expanding hunt. The local newspaper had given Sarah a commendation for her investigative work on the missing persons cases, praising her thoroughness and dedication. The irony was devastating. Sarah was being honored for helping to document her own disappearance and the disappearances of the creature's other victims. The true horror wasn't just Sarah's personal loss, though. That was terrible enough. It was the realization that the creature was evolving, learning, becoming something unprecedented in its scope and ambition. It was no longer content to move from victim to victim in sequence. It was building an organization of stolen lives, a network of predators wearing human faces and using human connections to hunt more effectively than any supernatural entity had ever managed before. From her prison in the mirror, Sarah could see the future the creature was building, a world where more and more people would disappear without a trace, their lives stolen, and their identities worn by things that had never been human. The creature had found a way to reproduce itself, to spread its influence beyond the confines of a single cursed object. It was creating a plague of identity theft that operated on a supernatural level, and Sarah's own skills and knowledge had been the key that unlocked this terrible potential. As Sarah watched the creature wearing her face type up another article about missing persons, she understood that this was how the world would end for people like her, not with violence or obvious supernatural phenomena, but with quiet disappearances and subtle replacements, with loved ones who seemed slightly different but not different enough to raise alarms. The creature had learned the most effective way to destroy humanity wasn't through dramatic confrontation, but through patient infiltration, replacing people one by one until nothing genuinely human remained. The mirror reflected Sarah's horrified expression back at her, but now she was the reflection, trapped and powerless while something else lived her life and used her identity to destroy others. She had become part of the very evil she had tried to resist. Her own abilities turned against her species. The antique mirror that had seemed like such an innocent inheritance had been a trap not just for her life, but for her soul, and through her, for the souls of countless others who would fall victim to the creature's expanding network of stolen identities and cursed objects.